Rush hour put a shine on everything. The rails, the wet street below, the windows stacked up the faces of the loop. Wind slid between buildings and turned breath to steam. On the northeast corner where Lake meets Wabash, an elevated platform held a Ravenswood train at a red signal, its cars idling in that nervous way machines do when they're made to wait. Ahead, an Evanston Express was clearing the State Lake platform after dispatchers had rerouted it the wrong way around the loop to get past a bulky switch. The timing meant the corner was crowded, a hinge between trains that didn't usually share space. The steel curve there was tight, a right angle that demanded obedience. Down the line, a Lake Dan Ryan train pulled out of Randolph/Wabash. Its motorman eased the handle and crept into the curve. In his cab, the signal stayed restrictive. He had just made a normal station stop and could roll below the speed that would throw the automatic brake. Passengers felt the train lean and heard only the rattle that always lived in the structure. Up in the glass box, the motorman had a problem that doesn't look like much when you write it down. His train, a red aspect, another train too close ahead, and a curve that forgives nothing. The platform crowd watched the Lake Dan Ryan set drift toward the corner like a car gliding into a parking space. The first touch, when it came, sounded like a fence post bumped by a bumper. A small collision, almost shy. Then the power stayed on. The rear train pinned the front one against the turn. Couplers flexed, then bowed. The first cars of the rear train climbed their own knuckles, noses rising like animals trying to free themselves. A Bud car lifted, then a Pullman behind it, weight stacking into a geometry that had only one answer. Steel popped. 2 cars rolled and fell, one onto Wabash Avenue, one across it. A third folded off the edge and came down on the support bracing. A fourth left the rail and hung half in, half out, coupled to safety by a length of hardware and fear. In the street were horns and screams and the hard clatter of glass arriving where it should never be. Some victims were passengers. Some were pedestrians who had been crossing the street under the comfortable shelter of the tracks. The rest were riders whose commute ended with daylight where a ceiling ought to be. 11 people died. More than 180 were hurt. Men tore at doors with crowbars. Firefighters threw ladders at open car ends and climbed. Ambulances took one load, then another, then another. On radio, the call repeated with the strained calm of people who know they're inside something they will never forget. While the last of the injured left the scene, a reconstruction began. Inspectors followed skid marks in soot and dust. Photographers measured angles with their lenses. The city's transit authority and the federal board both wanted the same thing, a sequence that the dead would recognize if they could look back. They plotted how far the Ravenswood had sat beyond the corner and how slowly the Lake Dan Ryan had approached. They traced the signal logic that had gone restrictive the moment the platform ahead was occupied. They timed the seconds between the nudge and the rise of the cars into the air. The answer was method, not mystery. A motorman proceeded against a stop indication and, after the first contact, kept applying power. On a sharp loop curve, the force had nowhere to go but up and out. People looked for a cleaner villain. They found a man with a record that made headlines easy, distracted at work, once seen reading in the cab, the sort who chatted with passengers when he should have been watching the rail. Tests found traces of marijuana. Investigators could not say whether he was actually impaired at the controls that evening. He was fired months later, and official reports put the fault on him, on his choices at a red signal, and on the decision to keep the controller forward after contact. That answer, the human one, was true. But the story also flowed through a second channel that mattered just as much. The system allowed a human to be enough. Earlier that day, an equipment issue had forced trains to run on an unusual pattern. A clockwise service had been sent counterclockwise, stacking routes that normally braided but didn't tangle. Dispatch knew it, crews knew it, and riders felt it in the slow creep around corners. The rule book permitted proceeding on site against a red under tight restrictions. A normal station stop could keep the automatic trip from grabbing a train that moved at a walking pace. In other words, the guard built into the loop could be beaten by ordinary behavior. The curve didn't mind until the moment it minded all at once. Victims' families told reporters about routines, where a daughter stood on the car to be near the stairs, how a man left 10 minutes early on Fridays, how two friends always split at Randolph, one to walk south, the other east into the wind. Survivors described quiet moments that turned in a heartbeat. A purse slid off a lap. A stranger reached out to steady a stranger. The floor became sky. On the street, a garage attendant said he watched people try to outrun a shadow that caught them. Crowds formed as they do in cities, fast and close, and then backed away when the work of the rescue made a kind of respectful circle. Tow trucks idled under police direction and did nothing until someone told them exactly where to be. The federal report did not waste language. It diagrammed routes, clocks, and signals. It described the curve and the logic that governed it. It listed car numbers and where each had landed. It concluded that the operator ran past a stop indication, and then, after striking a train waiting at the corner, applied traction that forced cars off the structure. It recommended changes that would make the same chain harder to build again. The city's transit authority rewrote the rule: no more proceeding on site against a red because you think you know what's ahead. A new rule, 6.4, required crews to call the control center for permission before passing a stubborn signal and, if allowed, to creep at a strictly limited speed with indicators in the cab confirming that everyone understood the risk. Engineers also fastened a stout beam along the structure so a car could not roll off into space if jackknifed again. The loop would still demand obedience, but new metal and new habits would backstop the human part. The corner returned to duty because cities do. Platforms filled. Trains took the bend with that squeal that sets teeth on edge and means things are working as designed. People stole glances down at the street where the photographs had been taken and then went back to their papers, their briefcases, their conversations picked up from yesterday. The scar was overhead, in steel scuffs and new bolts. If you didn't know, you wouldn't know. Inside the department, veterans folded the accident into the quiet commandments that aren't printed on posters. Don't get clever with reds. Don't trust your memory of the last time more than the signal in front of you. Don't let chatter turn into blindness. Up at the control center, the new rule changed the sound of evenings. More calls, more confirmations, more human voices, making sure that one man's confidence couldn't carry a whole platform full of strangers out over the street. On the street below, pedestrians kept moving under the tracks, quickening unconsciously at the corner, and then slowing when they realized they'd done it. Time took the edges off the public details. The number of dead settled. The injury count moved with the paperwork of hospitals. Photographs, the ones made from windows above the corner, the ones that caught two cars lying like dropped toys, stood in print and then in memory. Most people who saw them moved on. Families didn't. The ones left behind kept circling the same questions. Why that train, that curve, that day, that signal? Why a system that allowed one poor decision to gather that much force, and why a guard that could be stepped around at walking speed? There were answers, operational, procedural, and they helped some. They also sat cold on the table next to a folded jacket and a set of keys that wouldn't be used again. Every now and then, anniversaries invite retellings. The story gets framed by hindsight, with numbers that have settled and rules that are now normal. Editors pick the picture where the dangling car still clings to the rail, and an old firefighter tells a younger one about climbing into a tilted doorway and talking a stranger into handing him a child. A transit historian explains cab signals and trip enforcement with a patience earned by repeating it for years. The point of telling it again is not to reopen a wound. It's to remind people that systems, even good ones, are only as safe as their allowances. A single exception, granted by habit, exploited by confusion, can turn an ordinary corner into a place where steel forgets how to stay together. If you ride the loop today and feel the car slow before Lake and Wabash, you're measuring the distance between then and now. The operator is on the radio, not guessing. The structure carries an extra piece of iron that will never make the news for doing its job. The rules require a conversation before the exception. The danger that lived at the edge of that curve didn't vanish. It was fenced, labeled, and watched. That is as much as cities can do, and it is usually enough until it isn't. Sometime, somewhere, another evening shift will stack an unlikely set of things into a perfect shape. A signal, a habit, a judgment, made a few seconds late. The lesson from that corner is blunt. Don't build systems that count on the best of us at our worst moment. Build them to hold when a person is tired, distracted, or convinced this time is like the last. Build them so that a small mistake stops small. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.